April 29, 1945, 9 days before the end of World War II. In a small town in southern Germany, a group of American soldiers opens the gates of a concentration camp, and what they find inside breaks them forever. There are no words to describe it. Veterans who had survived Normandy, Sicily, and the Ardennes were completely paralyzed. Some vomited, others wept. Some simply sat down on the ground and couldn't get up for hours, because what stood before them was not a battle. It was an industrial slaughterhouse with a 12-year history, and in one corner of the camp, hands raised, stood the men who had made it all possible. 50 SS guards, alive, surrendered, waiting to be arrested. They never made it to arrest. In less than 20 minutes, every one of them was dead, executed. And what happened after those executions shook the highest ranks of the American military, reached the office of the most famous general of the war, and was buried in silence for decades. This is the story America took decades to tell. Before we continue, if you're interested in World War II stories that don't appear in textbooks, the ones that force you to ask uncomfortable questions, subscribe now. We tell the war the way it really was. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand who the men were that opened those gates. The 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, were not nervous recruits on their first combat deployment. They were soldiers forged by 3 years of continuous war. They had landed in Sicily in 1943. They had fought inch by inch through Italy. They had crossed France under constant fire and survived some of the bloodiest battles of the European theatre. These men had watched their comrades die. They had buried friends. They had kept moving forward when any normal person would have broken. They believed they had seen everything. They were wrong. On April 29, 1945, in the early hours of the morning, the advance units of the 45th Division received orders to move toward a town called Dachau. Intelligence reports indicated there was a concentration camp there. The soldiers knew the camps existed. They had heard rumors, heard talk of the conditions. But rumors don't prepare you for reality. Nothing prepares you for that. The first indication of what awaited them was not visual. It was the smell. Kilometers from the camp, the wind carried an odor none of the veterans could immediately identify. Sweet, heavy, impossible to ignore. It was the smell of thousands of decomposing bodies. When they approached the railroad tracks, they found the train cars. 39 sealed freight wagons. The soldiers opened them, and there they were. Corpses. Thousands of corpses stacked like sacks. Men, women, some so thin their bodies looked like paper. The train had come from another concentration camp called Buchenwald. The prisoners had been transferred to prevent the Allies from liberating them. Many had gone days without food or water inside those sealed wagons. Many had died along the way. Those who survived arrived at Dachau too weak to move and were left in the cars to die. Soldier John Lee of the 45th Division described that moment years later. He said he opened the door of the first wagon, and it took him several seconds to understand what he was seeing. His brain refused to process it. When it finally did, he stepped back, vomited against the tracks, wiped his mouth, took a deep breath, and kept walking, because that was what soldiers did. Keep walking. The camp gates opened at 3 in the afternoon. The first thing they saw was the main yard, and in the yard were prisoners, or what was left of them. 30,000 people who had survived 12 years of Dachau. 30,000 skeletons covered in skin, striped uniforms hanging from bodies weighing 30, 20, some 15 kilograms. Sunken eyes, sharply defined cheekbones, hands like claws. Some tried to walk toward the American soldiers and fell to the ground before reaching them. Others didn't even try. They stayed where they were, staring with blank expressions, as if they no longer had the capacity to believe in anything. The soldiers began handing out what they carried: combat rations, chocolate, whatever they had. Military doctors came running and ordered them to stop immediately. The prisoners had gone so long without food that giving them real nourishment could kill them. Their stomachs could no longer process normal food. Try to picture that. American soldiers holding food in their hands, looking at men dying of starvation, unable to give it to them because doing so would finish the job. While the doctors worked, other soldiers explored the rest of the camp. They found the gas chambers. They found the crematoria with human remains still inside. They found the punishment cells, tiny cubicles where prisoners had been locked away for weeks. They found the medical experimentation rooms, where Dr. Sigmund Rascher had performed experiments on living human beings. Hypothermia experiments, submerging prisoners in ice water. Pressure experiments in decompression chambers. Survival experiments forcing prisoners to drink seawater. None of those subjects were volunteers. All were prisoners. Many died during the experiments. And the Nazis had documented everything, recorded, filed, archived, with their characteristic meticulousness. The American soldiers found all of it, and then, from a corner of the camp, someone shouted, "The guards!" Around 50 men in SS uniforms. Some had tried to flee when the Americans arrived, but had left it too late and were surrounded. Others hadn't even tried. They had simply dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Surrender. Under the Geneva Conventions, the moment an enemy combatant surrenders, he acquires the status of prisoner of war. From that point forward, he has the right to protection. He cannot be executed. He cannot be mistreated. He must be treated humanely. That is the law of war, a law that had been in force for decades, a law the American soldiers knew, had been trained on, and one that many of their own comrades had been grateful for when the enemy had honored it toward them. That same law now told them they were obligated to protect the men who had operated that slaughterhouse for 12 years. No one gave the order. That is important to understand. No American officer stepped in front of those guards and commanded their execution. What happened was different, more spontaneous, more human in the worst sense of the word. A soldier looked at the guards, then looked at the train cars full of corpses, then looked back at the guards and fired. Another soldier did the same, then another. Within seconds, chaos erupted. Some guards tried to run and were shot in the back. Others dropped to their knees begging and were shot anyway. Some guards were beaten to death with rifle butts. In 20 minutes, approximately 50 SS members were dead. Some later estimates put the number higher. The exact figure was never officially confirmed, but what was confirmed was what had happened. American soldiers had executed surrendered prisoners of war. It was a war crime. No qualifications, no legal loopholes, a war crime. Not all the Americans took part, and this, too, is important. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commander of one of the battalions, heard the gunshots and ran toward the sound. When he arrived and saw what was happening, he didn't hesitate for a second. He physically placed himself between his soldiers and the remaining guards. He tore a rifle from a soldier's hands. He screamed at his men to stop, threatening to shoot anyone who continued. His soldiers obeyed. The execution stopped. But for most of the guards, it was already too late. Sparks spent the rest of his life trying to explain what he had witnessed that day, not justifying the executions, but explaining the context. Explaining that the men who had opened fire were not monsters, but soldiers who had seen things no human being should ever see, and that something inside them had simply broken. Within hours, the report moved up the chain of command, first to division headquarters, then to corps headquarters, then to army headquarters, and finally to the office of General George S. Patton. Patton was already at Dachau. He had arrived the day after the liberation to see the camp with his own eyes, not out of protocol, because he needed to see. He followed the same path his soldiers had walked. He saw the same wagons. He entered the same barracks. And the toughest general in the American war, the man who had crossed North Africa, commanded the largest armored offensive in Western history, fought in 2 world wars. That man walked out of a barrack and vomited on the ground. No composure, no restraint. He vomited. Then he ordered the civilians from the nearby town to come to the camp. He forced them to see what had been done in their name, and he made them bury the bodies with their own hands. But then came the report about his soldiers. The military machine moved immediately. The Inspector General's office demanded a full investigation. The Judge Advocate General's office prepared a memorandum with a single conclusion: court-martial, murder charges, prison sentences. There was no other legal option. A war crime was a war crime, regardless of who the victims were. And if the Americans were going to prosecute the Nazis for war crimes at Nuremberg, they had to hold their own soldiers to the same standard. The military lawyers were unambiguous. Even Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, made his position clear. This could not be ignored. If the Americans looked the other way at war crimes committed by their own men, they lost all moral authority to judge the crimes of others. The file landed on Patton's desk with one clear implicit expectation: act, prosecute. Demonstrate that the law is the law for everyone. Patton sat down in front of the file. Photos of Dachau, witness statements, Inspector General reports. It was all there, all of it clear. And he had to choose. On one side, the most powerful army in history had built its moral authority on respect for the rules of war. If he excused what his soldiers had done, he was saying the rules only applied when convenient, that war crimes were acceptable if the victims deserved to die. And that was exactly the same argument the Nazis used to justify what they had done. On the other side, the names and faces of men who had fought under his command for years, who had risked their lives, who had buried their friends, who had arrived at Dachau after 3 years of war and found something that had shattered them from the inside. What does a general do with that? Patton called in his staff and dictated his response to the Inspector General. It was direct, it was deliberate, and it was a carefully constructed lie. He wrote that the investigation was inconclusive, that during the liberation of the camp, in the chaos of the operation, with thousands of prisoners moving through the grounds and pockets of German resistance still active in the surrounding area, it was impossible to determine with certainty which deaths had resulted from combat and which had not. There was a grain of truth in it. The liberation had been chaotic, and there had been fire from German soldiers still resisting. But Patton had read the witness statements. He knew exactly what had happened. He was choosing not to see eye. And he went further. He added that even if executions had taken place, the emotional and psychological state of soldiers who had just witnessed the horrors of Dachau constituted a significant mitigating factor. And he used the term temporary insanity, a recognized legal defense. He was constructing a legal exit for his men. But the most important line came at the end. He wrote that he was not going to court-martial soldiers for killing SS guards in an extermination camp, and he added, "If that makes me complicit in a war crime, so be it, but I will not destroy American soldiers for doing what I myself might have done in their place." Patton was not saying what his soldiers did was right. He was saying it was understandable, and that he himself could not guarantee he would have done differently. Patton's response moved up the chain of command and created a problem no one wanted to have. The Inspector General was furious. This was obstruction of justice, protection of war criminals. The Judge Advocate General prepared a memorandum calling for direct intervention from high command. If Patton wouldn't act, someone else had to. But then the uncomfortable questions began surfacing in the highest offices of the American military. What would that trial actually look like? American soldiers on the stand describing what they had seen at Dachau. Defense attorneys calling camp survivors as witnesses. Photographs of the gas chambers shown to the jury. Records of the medical experiments. The names of 40,000 dead. The verdict was almost beside the point, because the trial itself would be a disaster with no way out. If the soldiers were convicted, America would appear as a country that valued the lives of concentration camp guards more than the lives of their victims. If they were acquitted, a devastating precedent would be set. War crimes are acceptable if the victims are bad enough. A precedent any future war crimes defendant could invoke in their own defense. There was no clean exit. Not from any direction. The investigation died in silence. No official statement, no press release, no announcement of any kind. The file was classified, archived, marked inconclusive, and disappeared into the corridors of American military bureaucracy. The soldiers who had fired went home, They lived their lives. They married, had children, worked, grew old. Not one was prosecuted. Not one spent a single day in prison for what had happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945. Some spoke about it decades later, some with guilt, others without. One veteran, already in his 80s, said something that captures the full moral weight of that afternoon. He said he knew what they had done was illegal, that he knew it the moment he pulled the trigger, that he didn't care, and that he never knew whether that made him a monster or simply human. Decades later, historians still cannot agree. One side of the debate holds that Patton made the right call, that court-martialing soldiers for a moment of human rage in the face of industrial genocide would have been an injustice as great as the one it sought to correct, that the SS guards at Dachau had forfeited any legal protection through their participation in mass extermination, and that there are crimes so enormous that the human response to them cannot be measured by the same standards applied under normal circumstances. The other side says Patton was profoundly wrong, that the rules of war exist precisely for the hardest moments, not the easy ones. That if war crimes are only prosecuted when the victims are innocent, the entire concept loses its meaning. And that civilization is not what we do when it's easy to be civilized, but what we do when it's nearly impossible. Both positions have solid arguments. Neither has a perfect answer, because there is no perfect answer. In his private diary, far from official reports and institutional pressure, Patton wrote something far more honest. He wrote that he could not condemn men for doing in a moment of passion what the entire world should have done as policy years earlier. And he added that if killing those SS guards was a crime, then everyone was a criminal for not having shut down that camp long before. That line is not a justification of the executions. It is something more complicated and more uncomfortable. It is an admission that the guilt of Dachau did not begin or end in that courtyard on April 29, 1945. It began in 1933 when the camp opened, and for 12 years the world knew, or could have known, what was happening inside, and chose not to act. Patton was saying that the soldiers who fired that day were not the only ones with blood on their hands, that the responsibility was broader, older, more uncomfortable than any court-martial could resolve. The Dachau executions remain one of the most debated episodes of World War II. Not because anyone defends the SS guards, but because they force us to confront something we would rather not look at directly. That law and justice do not always coincide, that what is right and what is legal are not always the same thing, and that war creates situations in which every available option is bad. Patton chose his soldiers over the law. He chose to protect men who had committed a crime because he believed that convicting them would have been a different kind of crime. Maybe he was right. Or maybe Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, who physically put himself in the line of fire to stop the executions, was the only man that day who kept his head when everyone else had lost theirs. What does it say about us that this story was buried for decades? And what does it say about us that when it finally came to light, the majority reaction was not outrage, but understanding? There is no easy answer. There never was. Patton knew it when he signed that report. His soldiers knew it when they pulled the trigger, and we know it now, 80 years later, looking at those black and white photographs and asking ourselves honestly what we would have done in their place. Would you have protected those soldiers or demanded they stand trial? Tell us in the comments, and if you want to keep watching World War II stories that have no easy answers, subscribe.